For more on the president's inaugural address and the Trump administration's top priorities, we're joined by CBS News political director and Face the Nation moderator, our own John Dickerson. John, good to see you.
Good morning.
A lot happening here. So the president is the titular head of the Republican Party, and yet the president's remarks yesterday almost didn't sound like those of a Republican president necessarily.
They sounded like the words of a Trump president, and that's what he is, and that's what the party is, and then we're now going to see who is in and who is out. I mean, but the lines that are drawn now on trade, but also on, there wasn't really the talk of free enterprise in the way you might have expected from a Republican speech. There was no longer any Reagan vision of the world in which democracy is worth protecting and kindling in other countries because there's a national security benefit to it. There was very much a feeling of close in America, no longer that kind of Reagan-esque view of the world. So those are two areas in which, and trade, obviously, where he's going to have some splits with his Republican Party. And, oh, by the way, the Republicans who've been running Congress, he criticized the politicians in Washington, since they've been in charge. They're the ones most on the hook for caring more about themselves and their own comfort than the rest of the country.
So how do you think he governs after making an opening gambit like this, John?
Well, it's a great point. Great that you put it in terms of opening gambit.
Yes.
I talked to Richard Lefrak, who's his friend of 40 years, the tycoon, New York real estate tycoon, and he said basically Donald Trump's negotiating strategy is he throws a bunch of hand grenades, destabilizes the conversation, gains control over it, and then walks back. It's his opening gambit in a negotiation. That's one view of it. The other is that he's just going to take this outside movement and use it to put pressure on the politicians in Washington. That means a lot of ugly battles. So the first version is a negotiation where he'll wheel and deal. He just uses this to set the opening stakes. The other is it's just a constant battle, and we'll have to see.
As a matter of strategy, his approval rating is at 37% right now. Like if history is any indicator, that number is likely to go down. Now, Donald Trump doesn't have an election in 2018, but Republicans do.
Republicans
and Democrats do.
But in an off-year election where intensity voters are the ones that participate the most, he has a super strong bond with those intensity Republican voters. And if he turns that electorate on those Republicans who are up, that has them very nervous. So he doesn't have the broad approval rating that you might want in a general election, but in terms of his ability to exert pressure on Republicans, they are nervous that if he turns one of his tweets against them, it will cause them real heartburn. And in conversations I've had, this is a real fear of theirs.
This is kind of a new style of governing. Do you think there's a risk that he will create fatigue from this constant disorder he likes to create?
Absolutely. I was talking to a Republican senator this week who that was this senator's opening point, which was this has obviously got the base rallied. He has this amazing connection, but will it wear thin over time? This is a challenge to the notion of the presidency, which is that the presidency was a job of persuasion, and which you tried to get the maximum number of people. Donald Trump spoke in his inaugural address and in his behavior to the people who brung him, and that's just a different thing. It's the people who brought him, and his theory is that things will work out in the end and some people will come along, but he did not do any of the rhetorical or stylistic things to reach out to people who were nervous about him. He spoke to that audience in front of him.
John, what about Russia? We know that John McCain and Lindsey Graham are showing no signs of backing down from that fight. They are, of course, leaders in President Trump's own party. Where do you see this going?
Well, you've got a couple of questions. One is the investigation into Russian meddling in the election that Graham and McCain are interested in getting to the bottom of, and so are the intelligence agencies. But then there's this Russia sanctions measure in the Senate, and that could be an early problem for the president if the Senate votes out sanctions against Russia and he doesn't want to have those sanctions. Then that's an immediate and early fight, and that's going to be one of the big early foreign policy questions. And also, obviously, there's a gap between Donald Trump's view on Russia and the view of his secretaries of defense and state.
All right, John Dickerson. Thanks, John.
Always good to see you.
Thanks.
And John's guest tomorrow morning here on Face the Nation will include Kellyanne Conway, counselor of President Trump, former presidential candidate Senator Bernie Sanders, independent of Vermont, and Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina.